For nearly 2 centuries after the founding of the United States of America, it seemed like it was constantly improving, aside from the Great Depression. New inventions were helping the nation prosper as the status quo would seemingly never change. Wives would stay at home, men wouldn't ever admit to being homosexual, and African Americans were treated as second class citizens. With the dawn of the 1960s, however, all of this was about to change. Topics that had been deemed untouchable subjects were becoming controversial issues, and the nation had become a ticking time bomb with citizens who were ready to explode. From the Watts riots of 1965 to the economic crash of 2008, the United States has had many moments that can prove that it has in fact declined over the 50-year period. This is not to say there haven't been ways in which the country has improved, but overall the failures outweigh the successes. With nearly every success came an even bigger failure, whether this failure was a social or economic failure. After these 50 years, it is safe to say that the United States has declined, as every decade has brought its fair share of failures to the table. A changing world brought changing attitude, as the 1950s were the final decade in American history when its citizens would be following the status quo. The happy, ugly, fun, brutal, cool 60s. The most controversial decade the United States has ever seen came out of nowhere and changed the complexity of history forever. Following a decade of economic prosperity came a decade filled with simultaneous peace and violence, as the U.S. became caught in a decade that seemed unescapable. Opinions on social issues were stronger, as people began the fight for equal rights for all, whether it be for homosexuals or African Americans. Even the music was changing during this era, as it became more powerful with messages directed towards the leaders of the country from artists such as The Temptations, The Rolling Stones, or Bob Dylan. However, as times were changing, the United States began to decline in this decade. It became new leaders with new ideas, but problems arose out of these newfound beliefs. Beginning with the 35th president, young and charismatic John F. Kennedy, when he was riding in a motorcade when former Soviet Union citizen and Cuban sympathizer Lee Harvey Oswald shot and killed him. It can be argued that the age of assassination began with this very moment. After this event, numerous notable figures were being assassinated, including Malcolm X in 1965 and Robert F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr., both in 1968. These are just a few whose lives were taken in this tumultuous decade, as the effects are still felt. Lyndon Johnson had success with his Great Society reforms, but when it came to the trouble in Southeast Asia, Johnson would become one of the most hated politicians in the country by Americans themselves. After the commencement of the Vietnam War, the United States was beginning to wonder if there would ever be a way out. However, the war seemed to have no end, as approximately 40 American soldiers were dying every day, with an end to the war seemingly nowhere in sight. In the age where peace was being spread all throughout America, violence was all that these young boys knew as they witnessed death on a daily basis. By August of 1968, Lyndon Johnson's approval rating had dropped so low, reaching a low of 35% of Americans approving of the job he had done. Through the president's inability to gain public support for the war, the Vietnam War became the largest example of failure in the 1960s. President Johnson wisely chose not to run for another term in 1968, as his disapproval showed no promise for another term. The damage was done. Vietnam was the prime example of why the country was failing, as hopeless soldiers continued to die day after day. Due to this and other reasons, the 1960s began the decline in the United States that we would experience for the next 50 years. In addition to the 1960s, the following decade would show another major decline in the United States. The presidential election of 1972 was approaching fast, and the incumbent candidate, Richard M. Nixon, was trying to earn enough votes to remain president. However, Nixon had broken some promises he still had to fulfill. Americans were angry about the escalation of the Vietnam War, as the death toll was rising daily. It didn't seem as though peace for these soldiers would be reached soon, so Nixon felt nervous in his chance of winning the election. Due to this, spies known as the quote-unquote plumbers bugged the Democratic National Convention at the Watergate Hotel in Washington, but were caught. Writers for the Washington Post named Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein were investigating the story, but they were not going too in-depth at first. Over time, however, they realized that there was corruption not only in Washington, but in the White House itself. They were able to uncover that the president, Richard Nixon, had approved of the cover-up, the reason for the break-in, and eventually many men resigned from their governmental positions. Multiple attorney generals resigned or were fired during the investigation, including John Mitchell, Richard Kleindienst, and Elliot Richardson. Nixon attempted to cover up the tapes that had apparently recorded the conversations, and finally, Nixon released the tapes to the public, proving that he had covered up information about the Watergate scandal. This proves to be a major decline in United States history, as for years to come the public had trouble trusting their politicians, such as Gerald R. Ford and Jimmy Carter. A few years after the Vietnam War had slowed for the United States, Jimmy Carter was finding issues in a different part of the world, the Middle East. After granting the Shah asylum in the United States, many supporters of the Ayatollah stormed the American embassy in Tehran, taking 66 American diplomats hostage for 444 days. Carter refused to yield to the terrorists, which proved ineffective. This would show the decline in American history, because the American presidents seemed to be unable to keep citizens safe in foreign countries. Carter would never be able to solve this problem, as it proved to be his most famous failure during his time in office. Therefore, while the greedy 70s were in full swing, the United States still seemed to decline due to the mistrust and ineffectiveness of the executive branch. The descent of America continued into the 1980s, as economic recession and cultural issues became much more prevalent in the United States. Known best with one of the most charismatic and charming faces in history, Ronald Reagan led the United States in a decade that was a vast improvement from the 1970s, as Reagan turned out to be one of the best presidents the U.S. has ever seen. And with events such as the Miracle on Ice in 1980, the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, many see it as an improvement in the United States. However, there were still enough issues that could show that it was a declining decade in United States history. Not only was there an economic recession in 1982, the United States had to deal with a stock market crash in October of 1987. Reagan decided to cut taxes during the recession of '82, but this had good and bad effects. The worst part about this decision was that the federal budget deficit rose to $221 million by 1986. Not only was the economy having a great deal of trouble, but the American culture was beginning to decline as well. New drugs such as crack cocaine were more available than ever at lower prices than most other drugs, making it very simple to possess. Even with First Lady Nancy Reagan's Just Say No campaign, drug abuse was rapidly increasing at a faster rate than ever before. Over one-third of Americans admitted to using marijuana at some point in their lives, the highest statistic of that kind. Even in popular culture, people were struggling from addictions, from basketball star Len Bias, who died the day after being drafted into the NBA of a cocaine overdose, or Whitney Houston, who was one of many musicians addicted to cocaine. There was also the AIDS epidemic, which burst onto the scene and killed many notable figures throughout the 1980s, as more information was being discovered about it. Culturally, the United States faltered during the 1980s, even if there were some other successes to go along with it. The 1990s brought upon a time with technological advances that the world hadn't ever seen before. Companies like Microsoft and Apple were paving the way for others to become successful, with the internet era beginning rapidly. New music genres became more popular, as the hip-hop scene was rapidly growing, and grunge music was becoming immensely popular. Even with these improvements in technology and with some generally strong leaders, the 1990s can still be considered a failure due to the Persian Gulf War and terrorizing events such as Columbine that would influence other modern events. George Bush was new as president, and in 1990 made the bold decision to go to war against Saddam Hussein in Iraq. Aligning themselves with Saudi Arabia and other Middle Eastern nations, the coalition forces were able to defeat Hussein in 1991. After the victory, President Bush had an approval rating of 89%, as it seemed like this ended up being a good thing. However, this war would have long-lasting effects as well. About 12 years later, lingering issues caused by this war created horrible relations between the U.S. and Middle Eastern nations, making this war a complete failure. Culturally, the United States was suffering throughout the 90s more than anything else. From the presidential scandal involving Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky to the terrorizing attacks on U.S. soil, the United States was struggling. In 1993, a bomb was put in a car parked under the World Trade Center, and as it didn't knock the Trade Center down, it struck fear into many Americans' hearts. In 1995, Timothy McVeigh parked a car with explosives in front of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City, killing 168 people. Arguably one of the scariest moments in American history would be the Columbine High School massacre, when Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold brought guns into their high school and murdered 12 students and one teacher on April 20th, 1999. Columbine was the first notable school massacre, which has prompted future events such as Sandy Hook of similar fashion to take place. The 1990s showed an even darker side of Americans, one that would continue into the 2000s. The 2000s took the technology from the 90s and took it all 10 steps further. From the improvements of the internet and the major spread of social media, the United States was becoming engulfed in technology. However, terrorism still reigned all throughout the world, as leaders such as Osama bin Laden and Saddam Hussein were in hiding and plotting ideas. One idea over the rest that signifies a decline in the United States was the 9/11 attacks hatched by Osama bin Laden. This was a day that will go down as arguably the most horrific day in American history. 2,996 people were killed in total from these attacks, as the new president George W. Bush was faced with a tough decision. He chose to enter Iraq and pursue those who had brought terror into the United States, as he would try and take down Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden. Even though Hussein was killed in 2006, the American people were angry about the war. They saw soldiers dying every day, and many didn't understand the reasoning for being in Iraq. Approximately 151,000 deaths were suffered in Iraq by 2006, a staggering number that showed that no improvement was being made as a result. While the war on terror was spiraling out of control, the American economy took a turn for the worse in 2008. The stock market plummeted in what many call the worst American recession since the Great Depression. Numbers of Americans were searching for jobs as many financial institutions began to go bankrupt. Most notably, the government was forced to bail out numerous banks across the country who had lost an immense amount of money due to the crash. Because of this crash, Americans weren't able to put money into the economy, and the economy is still feeling the effects of this crash even in 2014. Although the 2000s had some cultural successes, such as the beginning of legalizing gay marriage and the first black president the country has ever seen, the war on terror and the economy represent a massive failure in the United States. In conclusion, all 5 decades represent an extreme decline in the United States, as the culture became extremely divided on many issues, and the country shared many violent moments. Even when it seemed like there was hope for the American people, new events would pop up and show the worst of them. From the roller coaster ride that was the 1960s to the ultimate failure of the 2000s, not one decade in between could be argued that the United States improved during its 10 years. Although some decades, the 1980s and 1990s, were better than others, they still had enough problems, including drugs, terrorism, etc., to help prove that these decades brought upon a major decline in American culture. Even though these decades show that the U.S. is not the best country in the world, there are glimpses that it has the opportunity to be. From the end of the Cold War to the spread of equal rights, America has shown an opportunity to be the best country in the world. If leaders can begin to work together, the next few decades can become prosperous and fruitful.